Sorry, you were saying about Cream.
Yes, I was saying about Eric Clapton's guitar solos with his eyes closed. I think it was a big inspiration to you early on. But one thing that was shocking to me in 1985, you were at the University of Ontario, I think it was, and you wrote a critical letter of a professor who supported apartheid in the university newspaper, and you were fired, which is I was really shocked to hear that happened so recently, 1985. But anyways, you're back on track in 2002. I think it was 2002. You started the Saskatchewan. Let me just get the community-based education, free education project, and it went for a couple of years. I think 2002 to 2004, and you've written on that experience as well, providing free education, and then your 2009 book Selling Out, sort of criticizing the neoliberal market-based model of education, and then this book again that you've written in 2012, which is also the title of your presentation today. And here's the book. I have a printout copy. Critical Reflections on Teacher Education, Why Future Teachers Need Educational Philosophy. And I just thought I would read quickly the basic thesis. So for those who don't know, I'll give a brief introduction and then I'll hand it over to you, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Howard writes on page 5, without a basic understanding of philosophical issues and their relationship to educational practice, future teachers become lost in the demands of hierarchical school systems that emphasize conformity to rules and policies which negate the autonomy of qualified judgment defining their profession. And I argue that key concepts analyzed in 3 of the chapters can break the hold of the market and comprise a philosophical framework for a systematic approach to climate change teacher education capable of enlightening future teachers' classroom practices. I think that reflects and connects very well with the work that's being done at CEMUS. So with that in mind, I'll hand it over to you, Howard. Good to have you.
Tusen tack, Ryan. God kväll, hälsningar från Canada. Now that just about exhausts my Swedish, but I thought I'd just try and introduce with a little of the home language to whom I'm speaking. Actually, Ryan has sized so well that I could almost sign off at this point, but I won't. But it does give me great pleasure to speak to members of the Center for Environmental Studies Research Forum and the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University and Swedish Agricultural University. And let me say that I've looked at the programs of seminars that both research groups are giving this semester, and I find them both inspired and inspiring because they, in many ways, they cross so many different disciplines. And I find this really important in the modern university where specialization has become so important. As Alfred North Whitehead said in a book almost 100 years ago, that because of specialization, universities develop minds in a groove, and those minds are unwilling to cross over into different furrows. But you are clearly not caught in those minds in a groove. So congratulations. And I'd especially like to thank Ryan for arranging this system. As he mentioned, we've been in contact for a number of weeks talking about matters philosophical and other matters like music and different things. So that's been rather nice. And I want to say that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory of the Cree and Lakota peoples and the homeland of the Métis. Now, I'm not going to read from my book, although I may read a short passage later, but I'm going to talk about it. And I have some notes in front of me here. So if you see me looking down, that's why. I need these notes, even though I'm pretty familiar with the book, having reread it recently. Now, the book is dedicated to my parents, without whom none of my life obviously could have happened, but certainly writing this book. And it's dedicated to my lifelong partner, Viola, whom you just saw, um, without whom the book could not have seen the light of day, because of a number of things, including her ongoing loving support, but also because of numerous conversations we had during the couple of years that it took me to write it. And because she has a background in philosophy herself, these were very enlightening. And I'm going to say that I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm looking forward to the question period. One other thing before I get going is, as Viola mentioned, I have what's called an essential tremor, which was triggered when I returned from teaching for 3 years in Nigeria, West Africa. And I was given medication which caused, to which I was allergic. So if you see me tremoring, which you will see even on Zoom, don't worry about it. It's normal for me, okay? So why did I write this book? Here's the book. As Ryan said, it's called Critical Reflections on Teacher Education, Why Future Teachers Need Educational Philosophy. Well, it was a COVID project, but actually it's much more than that. Having spent 5 decades involved in teacher education, I thought, I kind of hoped, that I had something valuable to say about it. And it's about the importance of philosophy in educating future teachers, and specifically about how educational philosophy can improve the quality of teacher education. And then by implication, how educational philosophy can help to improve the classroom practice of teachers in schools. Now, my aim was to try to do this in a fairly accessible way. I don't know if I was successful in this, but that was the aim. And I did this by using narratives based on my own personal and professional experience to introduce and underline the major themes of each chapter. But as well, I used what I hope is reasoned argument throughout the book. Now, actually, this isn't just an academic question. I mean, it is an academic question, but it's more than that. It's an existential question. And I'll give you 2 reasons for that. At my own university, the University of Saskatchewan, when I joined the Department of Educational Foundations more than 30 years ago, there were 5 of us teaching educational philosophy. Since I retired, 3 years ago, there are none. No one is teaching philosophy of education. And this is a general problem in Canada as a whole. Because recent research has shown that in teacher education programs in Canada, there are less than 10% of required courses in educational philosophy. So this is a big problem, certainly in Canada. And I'm not sure about Sweden. I'd be interested to know more from you in the question period. But I do know that at Uppsala has a research unit for studies in educational policy and educational philosophy, STEP, which has distinguished faculty who teach both future teachers and graduate students. And they use their research in various fields to inform that teaching. So that actually I see as a source of hope, at least at Uppsala. So, excuse me. So let me start at the beginning with the title of the book, Critical Reflections on Teacher Education, Why Future Teachers Need Educational Philosophy. Now that's quite a mouthful, as I think you'll agree, right? It's actually not the most catchy of titles. So let me try and break it down by looking at each of the concepts in the title, okay? So reflections. Now, to reflect, I think, is a process that involves taking time to step back and think carefully about any subject matter. In this case, taking time to step back and think carefully about education and teacher education. And these reflections become critical when they reveal what is problematical in a text or in reality that calls for revision in one's thought or action. So critical reflections show what's problematical either in a text or in reality, calling for revision in one's way of thinking or one's way of acting. Now, the process of teacher education is indeed a process of educating, and educating comes from the Latin word educare, meaning to cause or enable to grow. So teacher education is a process of enabling young people, predominantly young people, to grow who have chosen to instruct students formally either in schools or other places of learning like the workplace. So that's what teacher education is. And these future teachers need, the next concept in the title, they need educational philosophy in the following sense, that without it, the value of their professional lives is impoverished. So to put it differently, if they have being exposed to educational philosophy, their professional lives are actually enriched. Now, philosophy, as I'm sure many of you would agree, especially those of you who are not philosophers, has a reputation as an esoteric discipline, right? But actually, it involves asking questions that have a direct bearing on how we can live and teach and learn. In fact, they have a bearing on how we should live and teach and learn. Because philosophy, at least in the West, in Western philosophy, has always been animated by such question as what is good? What is justice? What is knowledge? These foundational questions that are presupposed in many other disciplines. And that's because philosophy itself is an activity of critical reflection in precisely the sense that I gave you. It looks for problems in text and reality that require revision in one's thought or action. So it's a process of critical reflection. And we know from considerable amount of experience and evidence that children readily engage in asking such questions. Who am I? Is there a God? How did the universe begin? They ask these rather difficult questions from an early age. But we adults too often stifle their natural propensity to do so, to ask these questions. And I'm going to read you a short passage from the book, which illustrates in a little while, which illustrates the capacity of children to ask such questions. So, excuse me, I'm just going to have a bit of a drink here. It's only water, by the way. It's not vodka. I know it might look like vodka, but it's actually water. So what then? So I've spelled out the title, but what then does the book actually say? Well, in general, I argue that teacher education in 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, would be a lot better if philosophy regained its central position, along with other foundational disciplines like history, sociology, and anthropology of education. Now, until quite recently, all these disciplines were considered important in teacher education. So what happened? Well, I'm going to concentrate, and I concentrate in the book, on philosophy because that's what I've been doing for a long time. But the same argument, the same case can be made for the other disciplines I mentioned: history, sociology, and anthropology of education. All of them foundational disciplines. Now, in the first chapter of the book, I argue that the demise of educational philosophy is linked to the rise of the market model. And the market model is so called because it considers the goal of education and the goal of the market to be the same. But this, I argue, is a fatal mistake. It's a fatal mistake. And this is why. The goal of education is to create and pass on shared knowledge. But the goal of the market is to maximize private money profits. Now, the 2 goals are not only different, but they're actually contradictory. Whereas the purpose of education is to share ideas among those engaged in the process of inquiry, the overriding goal of the market is to make ever more money for private individuals and corporations. So on the one hand, education's goal is to share knowledge among those who are engaged in inquiry, the pursuit of inquiry, whereas on the other hand, the goal of the market is to amass greater money profits, and the more money that is amassed by private individuals and corporations, the less money that can be shared among other people. So there's a contradiction between these 2 goals or purposes. Now, at least in Canada, and possibly also, I know also in Europe, but certainly in Canada and in the other 2 countries I consider, government officials, university administrators, school boards, and corporate representatives overlook this contradiction. They overlook this contradiction. And they all repeat the same mantra that education and teacher education, and I'm going to quote, must make Canadian workers, in the case of Canada, must make Canadian workers and teachers more competitive in the global marketplace. Now, I don't know if you've heard that in Sweden, but there are variations on that theme. Sometimes it's made in terms of making workers more competitive in the information economy, but that's the general mantra that we hear from powerful representatives in both the public and private realm. Now, as a result, as Ryan mentioned in what he read from my book, as a result, teacher education dispenses with the foundational disciplines that I've mentioned, deemed to have no real, that is, market value. And this turns teachers into technicians whose professional capacity to make qualified and informed judgments about what and how they teach is reduced. And they have little time to address, less and less time to address the learning needs and capacities of their students. So that's the net result. Now, it's interesting that a similar argument is made by Carl Anders Säfström and Nicholas Manson about how the marketization of education undermines the principles of democracy and equality in the Swedish context. And they made this argument in an article in the European Education Research Journal earlier this year. So this argument that I'm making is not unique. It's being made by other scholars and researchers, including those in Sweden, which I found very interesting. It's a really great article, by the way. So having critiqued going back to my book, having critiqued the current state of teacher education, I argue in the rest of the book for its reconstruction on the basis of several key concepts or key ideas. And together, these key concepts comprise what I think is a philosophical framework capable of articulating a robust climate change teacher education. Now, I have to say, this is a very big claim on my part. I admit that. It's a big claim. And it's one that I make in a non-dogmatic way, a way that is open to question. And I hope that in the question period, you will pose me questions about it, and even difficult questions. Why not? Go for it. But, you know, if you're speaking personally about this, if you're going to go, my belief is you're going to make a claim in any field, if you have the evidence and the reasoning to back it up, why not go for the full 10 yards? Why not go for goal, right? And that's what I'm doing in the rest of this book. Now, I also argue that indigenous knowledge systems have an important place to place in any such framework, any philosophical framework of climate change education, teacher education. And at this point, I'll just mention two such concepts from indigenous knowledge systems. The first of these is what's called two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing, and this has been advanced by a number of indigenous authors here in Canada and the United States. Now, two-eyed seeing provides a lens through which both indigenous and Western forms of knowledge are valued and can work together to provide a critical understanding of dominant value systems and dominant knowledge systems, and in this case, dominant value systems that hinder climate change education. So two-eyed seeing is a lens that uses both indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge to question in a critical manner dominant knowledge and value systems. So that's the first concept from it. The second is indigenous storytelling, which is a way of knowing that emphasizes relationships with the land and with all living creatures, and relationships with ancestors and kinships groups, and with the languages and oral traditions of indigenous peoples. So indigenous storytelling is a way of not knowing that recognizes the importance of the land in the cultures and languages of indigenous people. And as one of my indigenous colleagues puts it, actually the narration of indigenous stories is a transformational moment that links the past to the present and the future, at least in the context of indigenous cultures. So those are two concepts that I use in this framework for climate change education: two-eyed seeing and indigenous storytelling. Now, as a non-indigenous author, I'm also aware that the Western philosophical tradition has tended to subordinate all other philosophical systems. It's tended to do that. And since most of the philosophical concepts I use here are from the Western tradition, I've approached this question about the nature of knowledge, what philosophers call this epistemological question, this question about the nature of knowledge. I approach that with caution throughout the book. But I'll leave it up to you to see if this tension between the two sets of concepts is resolved. I don't think it is fully resolved. I'm not sure exactly how one can fully resolve it, but I leave that as an open question. Okay, so the first of the concepts that I use for this philosophical framework for climate change teacher education is taken from the philosophy of Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, British logician, mathematician, philosopher, social activist, peace activist, educator, who during his long life went to jail twice in his opposition to war. I just mentioned in passing that Russell's view of the scientific method in philosophy is kind of interesting. And if there are scientists in the audience, they might be interested in raising that question in the question period. But I'm not going to say more about that because that could take us some time. So Russell believed that what he calls the growing principle of life animating the whole of nature is sacred. And it's especially prominent in children. And he makes this case in a book he wrote called The Principles of Social Reconstruction in 1916 during the First World War. Now, only where educators recognize this growing principle of life and have what Russell calls reverence for its presence in each child can the process of growth at the core of education take place. And the children's sense of caring for humanity and for a balance with nature, can those senses flourish? Now, to be successful, Russell argues, teacher education must be founded on the same respect for the planet as supporting all of life. So there has to be a respect or reverence in teacher education for it itself as a source of life. And in addition to that, Russell argued that future teachers should have the courage to express their views based on evidence and reasoning, the wisdom to know how to do so, coupled with a tentative approach to the knowledge they pass on to students. So he thought that teachers should have courage to express their views that based on evidence, wisdom to know how to do that, and an approach to passing on knowledge that is tentative and non-dogmatic. Okay, so that's the first of the concepts I use, the growing principle of life. Okay. A little more water on board just to keep me going here. Okay. Now, the worldwide movement of philosophy for children provides two further concepts for a robust climate change teacher education. Now, the first of these is what's called a community of inquiry, a community of inquiry. And a community of inquiry enables children to engage in respectful and critical dialogue about ethical and logical questions, guided by teachers who have learned the art of philosophical discussion through ongoing practice. So, community of inquiry enables children to express views about ethical and logical questions in a respectful manner of others, and they're guided by teachers who are well educated in philosophical discussion and through ongoing practice in doing that. Now, this process is facilitated when children engage in storytelling, the second concept, themselves. And they read stories that stimulate their imagination and their capacity for reasoning. So storytelling is an important way in which students learn this process of reasoning about ethical and logical questions. And Matthew Lipman and Anne Margaret Sharp, who were the founders of Philosophy for Children, whom I was fortunate enough to meet at a conference many years ago in the United States, both wrote novels that have been used with children for this purpose, for animating their imagination and reasoning capacity. And they were actively involved in developing the capacity of teachers to use storytelling in communities of inquiry. And I just want to read you a very brief passage from Matthew Lipman's first novel called Harry Stottlemeyer's Discovery. Lipman wrote this for 10-year-olds. And as I mentioned, the purpose is to engage them in reasonable discussion. So in chapter 1 of this book, Harry Stottlemeyer's Discovery, Harry has learned in school that when sentences beginning with the word all are reversed, they are false. For example, all model airplanes are toys. Now, when that's reversed, all toys are model airplanes, it's false, right? And obviously, he must have learned this from an enlightened teacher in school, probably one who uses the community of inquiry. But when Harry gets home from school, he finds his mother talking with her neighbor, Mrs. Olson, who suggests that another neighbor, Mrs. Bates, only talks about wanting to help the poor, which is what, quote, all those communists keep saying, making her wonder if this other neighbor, Mrs. Bates, is also a communist. Suddenly, Harry realizes something. Mrs. Olson, he says, just because, according to you, all communists are people who want to help the poor, that doesn't mean that all people who want to help the poor are communists. Okay? So what this shows, in a rather amusing way, is that Harry has learned how logical reasoning can actually pay out in everyday life and help to expose prejudice and bad reasoning. And he uses it in a practical way when he gets home from school. So I think it makes the point quite clearly. So those are the second set of concepts that I'm using, community of inquiry and storytelling. Now, to complement Russell's growing principle of life, the concept of life value, articulated by Canadian philosopher John McMurtry, is also integral to my account of climate change teacher education. So what is life value? Actually, it turns out to be a fairly straightforward idea. Life value, McMurtry argues, stems from the capacity of the earth to support and reproduce life by promoting greater diversity among all species without endangering any of them. So life value stems from the capacity of the earth itself to support and promote the diversity of all species, including humankind. Now, this capacity of life value, which constitutes what McMurtry calls the life ground of value, is the very grounding of value in the planet, produces such goods as clean air, clean water, as well as nourishing food, without which the life of all creatures is diminished. So the life ground of value provides these goods upon which life depends: clean air, clean water, nourishing food, etc. In this life economy, what McMurtry calls a life economy, wealth is equated with the life-giving capacity of the planet, not with the money sequences of the global market that maximize private wealth for investors. So in the life economy, wealth is actually equated with this life-giving capacity of the earth to all creatures, not with maximizing private money profit. Indeed, the life economy is systematically under attack from the global market, but it is sustained and defended by what he calls the civil commons. And the civil commons, or if you like, the built commons, are a set of interlocking institutions that promote not only goods like clean air and clean water, etc., but also publicly funded healthcare, public education, wilderness spaces, public libraries, and public broadcasting. So the civil commons promotes these other goods that promote life, but they are under attack from the global market, as I think we see quite generally, and certainly in terms of education, at least here in Canada and North America. So that's the third concept that I use, and that is of life value. Okay. Now you might ask, that's all very well, Howard, Woodhouse, but what evidence is there that these concepts have any traction in teacher education? And I think that's a very fair question. Okay, so what evidence that they actually are being used in teacher education? Well, I'll give you 3 examples. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I'm getting near the end of what I'm going to say. But I say a lot more about these examples in the book. And I could say more in the question period if you're interested in asking. So the first example is from Canada. And at the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program in Prince Albert, which is in North Saskatchewan, and the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program is primarily for Métis students, future teachers who are of mixed heritage, namely both Indigenous and European. At this program, Professor Bente Huntley, a Cree Métis professor, has used land-based education, which is an Indigenous concept, land-based education, to familiarize future teachers with an understanding of the earth as the source of all life. And she does this in weekend camps at the beginning of each academic year. Students spend 3 days in nature where they learn the value of diverse ecosystems, both from and with nature. That is, they're learning these in nature, from nature, with nature, not just simply from books, the value of these various ecosystems and the earth as a source of all life. That's the Canadian example. In the United States, the entire campus of Oberlin College in Ohio is now net carbon negative. The whole campus is net carbon negative, produces no carbon at all. And Professor David Orr, who's a well-known environmentalist, who led this initiative, promotes, and I'm going to quote what he says, he promotes life as the only defensible foundation of liberal education. So life is the only defensible foundation of liberal education for all in both the humanities and the sciences. And he gives a fairly detailed description of the kind of curriculum that he has laid out in terms of doing that, as with life as the core of liberal education in both the humanities and sciences. And this is a process that I believe could be readily adapted with some changes to teacher education. So that's my second example. Third, in the United Kingdom, for 30 years, Schumacher College, which is situated in the southwest of England, for 30 years, Schumacher College has educated citizens from all walks of life about sustainability education and the value of ecological diversity. And more recently, the college has introduced courses for credit in conjunction with the University of Plymouth, the neighboring University of Plymouth, a model, and this is a model where you actually combine both non-formal education with formal education for credit, right? This is a model that I believe lends itself quite readily to teacher education. Again, it'll need some adaptation, but it lends itself to that. So those are my three examples. So by way of conclusion, I think there are grounds for hope that an awakening is taking place regarding the need for climate change teacher education. But this process cannot delay any longer. For as Sir David Attenborough warned the United Nations in 2021, the climate crisis is, and this is what he said, the greatest threat to security that humanity has ever faced, and it is now upon us. Okay, and with David Attenborough's words, I'll finish what I've got to say at this point.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. I think we'll have a lot of questions.
Thank you for a very deep, articulate, and cogent, inspiring lecture. So what would you say about the reflection of what Margaret Thatcher did as a revolution to change the mind and hearts of people so that they would think in the neoliberal way? How is this reflected then in the praxis of not just teachers' education, but you could say in private elite education? Illich would argue that it would be both elitist, public and private. And so we are dealing with the problem of privatization, individualistic kind of frame of mind that then you could say is uncritically taken by would-be teachers. I don't know if I was able to formulate my question coherently, but do I make sense to you?
Yes, yes, it does. And thank you for your kind words about my lecture. Now, this is a very big question you asked, which really, there's almost two parts to it, as I see it. One is about the influence of Margaret Thatcher, and then what's her influence upon how education is taking place even today because of the neoliberal approach that she engendered. Well, just briefly about Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, she was very important in developing a neoliberal approach. And you're absolutely right, she was important in developing the mindset that has engendered, that has brought it about. I was actually in England when the miners' strike took place in 1983, and it was very vicious the way in which the Thatcher government attacked the miners and were able to break unions, for example, and make it much more difficult for unions to organize. And they were distinctly out to break unions. And I think that's one of the planks of neoliberalism, is that along with the deregulation of the private sector and the over-regulation of the public sector, which includes schools. So I'm going to move on to how that takes place now still. And that can be seen, by the way, in the United Kingdom, particularly in England, where with the introduction of a very strict national curriculum in England, with definite ways of testing at several grade levels, individual students and schools and teachers, so in order to punish those that don't measure up to the metrics that are used. And those metrics are borrowed directly from the marketplace. So it is a way in which the market model of education was really brought into education in a number of ways. I could say more about that, but let me say that I think the net effect of this has been, and it's, I think, worse in the United Kingdom, worse particularly in England and in the United States, but it's even true in Canada, that what this has meant is that powerful agencies outside education, both the state and private companies and organizations, have greater and greater influence upon the goal of education, what's taught, etc. And this hampers the capacity of teachers to make autonomous judgments about what they're teaching and how to teach, as they're constantly being scrutinized in order to see if the results they're getting from students is measuring up to the metrics that are promoted by both government and by these outside corporations, companies, largely in terms of what those metrics are. How many students are going to be able to compete in the global marketplace? And they measure where this is done in the most vicious ways, and it has been in, fortunately it's changed, but here in Canada, in Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada, where I used to teach, this has been done to measure schools and to defund those schools that are not measuring up. And they're usually in poorer economic areas, right? So it's a direct attack upon working class students, and often students from different ethnic communities. I could say more about that, but I'll hold back for now, okay? And if I just say, I could say more about that if someone wants to ask about how that plays out in Sweden. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Sure, I'll go ahead if that's all right. Can you hear me, Howard?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
I guess you can't see us, but you can hear
No, I
us.
can't. It's okay. I did see you at the beginning, and I saw some of the other people, but
Okay, well, my name is Isak Stoddard. I'm sitting here in the countryside outside of Uppsala and enjoying this talk very much at the end of the workday. Thank you so much for your talk. I especially appreciated some of the examples you brought up at the end. My partner studied at Schumacher College about 10 years ago, so I have some experience, and I've worked a bit with them as well. And also I've had some exchanges with David Orr and Oberlin College as well. So those were two interesting examples. I wasn't aware of the one in Canada, so thanks. I'll have to follow up and ask you more about that after this session, but which sounds really, really exciting also with the land-based education. But just briefly, I have two questions. I guess the first one is building on the start of your talk, where you talked about the capacity of children to ask the really key and pertinent questions, and then something seems to happen once we go through our educational system. And this is also something that I've experienced in my own life, and to some degree I sort of have found myself thinking about my life as a process of getting lost and then trying to find my way back to where I started, but perhaps with the experience of of having lived and hopefully learned something in the process. And this made me think about also an appreciation of, I think my schooling and my educational sort of the socialization that took place through schooling was a part of, well, contributed to getting lost to some extent, but it also, to some extent, also helped me to, I think, revolt and to question certain things. So there's an aspect of going through sort of a conformative process where you have to sort of learn to discern and learn to sort of intuitively react to something that feels wrong. But I think that was very much, I was able to do that at certain moments, and thankfully so, based on a few people that I met along the way and a few contexts where I saw something else than what was usually served up as the sort of within the educational system. So I guess what I'm wondering here is about your thoughts on sort of formal versus non-formal learning. And I mean, is there a value of sort of would it be better to have an formal educational system that just made children continue asking these fantastic questions? Or is there also spaces in which can't be formalized or institutionalized that we have to also make sure to protect and to ensure that they're lively and well as well, outside of all these sort of formal processes that we have? I guess the question is about sort of your thoughts on the institutionalization of learning, and if it can never really be be what we would hope it would be. Right. The second one is, very briefly, is just a quote by Alfred North Whitehead from I think it's from Science and the Modern World from 1925, where he talks about it being important to be vigilant in critically reviewing our modes of abstraction. And personally, I'm researching climate change a lot, global quantitative way, which has made me question that mode of abstraction and what it actually does to our thinking and our way of living our lives and thinking about the future, our capacity to envisage different kinds of futures. Right. So I was interested to hear your thoughts on that. I think you're all already sort of thinking about this and bringing in indigenous knowledge systems and other ways of framing climate change. But I guess my question is about the sort of the limits of climate change as a framing for finding a better way to run teacher education. So those were my two questions.
Right. Right. Well, thank you for your two big questions again. And I'm glad that you've had such contact with Schumacher College and with David Orr. That's great. I've never met David Orr, but I have been to Schumacher College and I've spent a day there with students on an international study tour quite a few years ago. So I'm going to there are two questions. One is about the institutionalization of learning and one about abstraction and what Whitehead says about abstraction. I'm going to start with the second one first, if you don't mind. What Whitehead says about abstraction, as I understand it, is that we have to be aware of abstractions that are not in conjunction with our daily experience, with our concrete experience, with our lived experience, because they can take us away from the importance of experience. Right? It's not that abstractions are a priori wrong. It's that we have to make sure that our abstractions are always emanating, flowing from our daily experience. I mean, you may know that he writes about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which I won't go into too much, but it's essentially the danger of abstractions is for mistaking the map for the actual geography. That is to say, we get hung up on these high abstractions in any field, including philosophy, and we mistake them for reality. That's the fallacy. We misplace them for concrete experience. And we have to be constantly aware of doing that, not to do away with abstractions. After all, he too, like Russell, was a logician, and he wrote about physics too. He's a physical theoretical physicist. But we have to ensure that those abstractions are flow from experience. And I think, just to relate that to climate change, that means that the quantitative work that you use can be extremely valuable, right? It can be extremely valuable, provided that it actually is borne out or is directly related to or interrelated to not only your experience, but the experience of people who are suffering from climate change, which, by the way, happens to be, in general, not only poor people, but especially indigenous peoples throughout the world, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. Okay, so beware of abstractions if they are too abstract, in a way, if they don't relate to the concrete experience of yourself and of humanity. I think that's Whitehead's message. The question about the institutionalization of learning is a very interesting one, and it's one that philosophers have looked at for a long time. I suppose if you go back to Plato, to Socrates in the West, and in the East, if you go back to Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, you have this whole view that actually education takes place best in the marketplace for Socrates, or paying attention to the way of nature, the Tao in nature for Lao Tzu. So this is a huge question. I think, just relating it to the question of philosophy for children and how children have their natural propensity to ask philosophical questions, certainly Lippmann and Sharp, the founders of philosophy for children, they actually were actively involved in introducing this community of inquiry and storytelling in schools, initially in the United States, but their programs spread throughout the world to about 50 countries on 5 continents. And through the community of inquiry, students have learned to question and to be reasonable human beings. And what they hope for in being reasonable human beings is not simply rationality, but also that to recognize in being reasonable that some questions, especially ethical questions, such as climate change, ethical questions, which is both a scientific and an ethical question, ethical questions are ambiguous very often. And so being reasonable means that one has to recognize the ambiguity involved in such questions. Can that be done in schools? Well, I have to say that I'll just give you one concrete example. One of my former graduate students here in Saskatchewan, who predominantly teaches English, but he teaches a class in philosophy for children using the community of inquiry. And he finds that students actually latch onto it readily. They love it. And now he's a high school teacher. And I've met some of his former students, and they just spontaneously said how much they enjoyed this class. One other example from Ontario is that philosophy has been used at the high school level in Ontario for now 25 years, and it's become a very, very popular subject. There are problems with it. I mean, there are problems with all these things, but at least there's some hope that teachers, when they have the capacity to use philosophical reasoning, to encourage that reasoning among their students actually take great joy in it. And one last thing I'll say about this is that in England, the University of Sheffield, I think it was, conducted a longitudinal study of where philosophy was used in classrooms. And what they found was that it benefited all students because it has a kind of a cross-fertilization in all subjects, but it especially helped students from poor economic backgrounds, predominantly working class students, most. It helped them most, not only in their performance in understanding philosophy, but also across the curriculum. They improved in their understanding in other areas, mathematics, English, etc. So I think there's hope, although I do agree with you that I think that informal learning is very important as well. I think we learn as much, a good deal from life, and I know I have, like you have, and that sometimes we need, as you pointed out, we need a special teacher or professor who really enables us to see the light, as it were, and enables us, gives us this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? This kind of coup in French, this blow that we actually, our understanding changes. And that, fortunately, there are teachers, I've experienced some as well, who've done that for me. It's a rather long answer.
Thank you, Howard.
Any other questions? Or shall I? I'll go ahead. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. It was great to hear you spell out your framework for teacher education on climate change, and that's what I'll focus on.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like, I'll provide a little bit of context. I guess one thing that I have been taught, because I also studied philosophy, and I think you've met Aaron, my supervisor, once, and you're a bit familiar with his work, maybe. But him and many other people who have engaged with the history of ideas in relation to, like, environmental philosophy, ecofeminism and these kind of fields, have recognized that the sort of mechanistic worldview of the 17th century scientific revolution and the mechanistic metaphors, the way of understanding nature and life and mind as mechanism, have played a pretty foundational role in our environmental crisis. And at the root of all that, aside from the determinism and the atomism, which link together with the kind of materialism, a very crude mechanistic materialism, as Whitehead called it, to sort of deprive any kind of phenomenon that you're describing in the text, talking about life values or life economy or civic commons, is kind of or what Russell called the growth principle of life. It's sort of negated through this mechanistic kind of framework, which has been so dominant in the last 3 or 4 centuries. So we could take this in many directions. I guess partially because I see neoliberalism as an expression of that kind of mindset, reviving itself. So I wondered, Russell had this, you mentioned this notion of reverence, and I wondered how that sits in tension with this kind of materialism, and how he dealt with it. Like, did he actually question that mechanistic view of nature, or did he uphold a kind of subjective idealism, or how did he confront that issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, his approach, his approach is both different from and has some relationship to Whitehead's approach, but it's different from it. So, okay, let's start with what he means by reverence. So reverence is this, it's interesting because, Russell is generally seen to be, if not an atheist, then certainly an agnostic, right? Mm-hmm. But he's using this term reverence, which he recognizes has a spiritual connotation to it, and that nature in general has to be revered in this very sense. And children in particular, each child carries this growing principle of life, for which educators and adults in general must revere it. They must regard it as sacred. And of course, his critique of the educational system is that it doesn't regard each child as sacred. The state education indoctrinates people to be, in the case of the First World War, to be willing killers on either side, and it deprives. So it is exactly that mechanistic approach to education that is depriving children of their capacity to realize their full potential. Because in enabling the process of growth, the idea is to enable this ongoing potential for life. And this is a theme that Russell, there's a long line of humanistic educators that have this conception. So he's not alone in making that claim. Now, does this concept of reverence and the principle of growth, is that undermined somewhat by any mechanistic views that he holds? Well, I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, as I show in the book, he adopts for about 8 years or so, he becomes a behaviorist, which at least in terms of its methodology, he thinks that he comes to believe that behaviorism, which dispenses with the notion of consciousness, which sees mind simply as a construct from neutral stuff called sensations, and matter the same, that he can do away with any guiding notion of mind and consciousness and resolve it in terms of sensations, which are neutral. And behaviorism enables him to use a methodology which he thinks is closest to physics. And he does adopt what I've called elsewhere a mechanistic view of the individual, of children. It had a drastic effect, a very bad effect on the education of his own children. But I think because, and I would argue, partly because of philosophical reasons, because he came to see that behaviorism was misguided, that actually it wasn't in any way objective any more than any other claim to knowledge, that actually, and he makes fun of it in a book called An Inquiry into Meaning and Truth. And so for philosophical reasons, he comes to see that it's actually not able to give the kind of knowledge he's seeking. But secondly, I think because of the influence of Dora Russell, his second wife, with whom he ran Beacon Hill School, and who was through and through a humanist, which Russell wanted to be, and is certainly when he's talking about the reverence for the growing principle of life, a humanist. Dora Russell influences him so that actually the very praxis of the school they ran together, Beacon Hill School, was non-mechanistic, was actually much more organic in its nature. And they write about this in a book they wrote together, if I can remember the name, Principles of Industrial Civilization. They write about the importance of the organic individual, right? And so there is indeed, you're right, a tension in Russell between the organic notion for which in the child for whom we must have reverence and a more mechanistic view. But fortunately, he gets rid of that mechanistic behaviorist view by the time that the Beacon Hill School is running, and also later at the same time in his philosophy, and he gets rid of it. So there is indeed this tension in Russell's work between those two, between an organic conception of the world and the planet as supporting all life, and its growing principle of life for which we must have reverence in general, in nature and in children, and a more mechanistic view. But as he expounds his later educational philosophy, he reverts to a much more humanistic view. So there's always this ongoing tension in Russell. It's one of the things, by the way, I think, that makes him a very interesting thinker, because he does portray that very tension that you're talking about, because he is actually, in many ways, a secular prophet. That's how he was seen. A kind of a secular prophet. And his prophecies were sometimes true and sometimes not, but he always had that belief in the healing power of nature, if you like, and of a fundamental faith in humanity, as despite all the horrors going on in the world, faith in humanity is capable of resolving deep problems such as war.
Interesting. Thanks, Howard. I'm glad that you've challenged my mechanistic conception of Russell.
Because it's so easy to write people off. I mean, you've got to remember that Russell and Whitehead worked for a decade on Principia Mathematica, right? I mean, their major work in logic and the foundations of mathematics. And as I argue in a paper that I wrote some time ago, it's not surprising, therefore, that, for example, in their educational philosophy, there's a tremendous congruence. I mean, Russell writes about the importance of this growing principle of life. Whitehead writes about the rhythmic cycles of growth. I think Whitehead's concept of the rhythmic cycle of growth is more developed than Russell's, but they're very, very similar. So there's a a place in which I think these two great thinkers are in unison.
I think that I'm not. It's shouldn't surprise me. I'll put it that way. Are there any other questions? Does anyone want to shoot? No? All silent?
Well, I hope I haven't intimidated people. Come on, someone must have a question. Maybe about Sweden and the Swedish educational system. I'd be delighted to hear something about that. I've read things, but I'd be really interested in anyone's personal experience and how the Swedish education system may have changed in the last while.
Anyone got any experience in that regard?
I could just chip in, but I've already spoken, but I mean, I can just say that it's Isak again. Hi. So my mom's a teacher, and I have followed her work obviously from very close at hand, and she's worked in the Swedish as a teacher in first to sixth grade for the last 30 or 40 years. She's recently retired. And I mean, I think what you were sort of laying out, Howard, in terms of on a more global level and sort of the trends have obviously been very present here as well, with an increased focus on metrics and going further down into the age groups to sort of increase bureaucracies, increase pressures on teachers to assess at lower levels, and she refused in many ways. So she got in trouble, and she wrote debate articles as much as she could, and created small little communities of other teachers that also were a sort of form of resistance. And sometimes they had a vice chancellor or a rector of the school that was able to sort of insulate the school and help them to do what they actually were there to do, which was to teach and to prepare their be passionate teachers, but at other times, there was people that were basically just, middle hands. So I think, I mean, she was appalled at the sort of things that was coming up there, and a lot of times also the authorities not knowing, just kind of handing it out to schools to do their own assessment criteria and develop these sort of things, and spending lots of time to put up these kind of matrices and these sort of things. And so she went back to them and said, well, if you want us to do this, why don't you develop it? And they said, well, we don't have they were maybe honest. They said, well, we don't have the expertise to do that. So it was this kind of vicious cycle of, but I think that was her experience, unfortunately, of becoming more and more difficult to have space to do her job.
Right. Well, it's good to hear that your mother was involved with other teachers in groups that were able to resist this bureaucratization of the educational system, of the school system, and that they were defended by the rector of their school. That's really good to hear, because it is true, there are some administrators who are uneasy about this whole neoliberal agenda, but they're becoming few and far between, unfortunately. When I talk to I still do talk to graduate students who are themselves teaching in the schools here in Saskatchewan, the common complaint is exactly what you've mentioned. That is that the people at the school board downtown, they don't know what they're doing. They're out of touch with education, and they adopt harebrained ideas that are kind of current for a couple of years, and everyone's supposed to follow them without anyone really understanding what they mean, and then they change them again because some advisor, often from the States, unfortunately, in our case, these ideas come from the States, which has a terrible educational system at the moment, but these ideas often move northward. They implement, they implement a new policy which goes against the one that was previously being promoted. And so what happens is that many teachers resist this by just ignoring what comes down from above, which is, I think, a good strategy in many ways, but it's also very, very demoralizing. It demoralizes teachers, and there's a huge dropout rate. Let me just relate this actually to what I've read about Sweden. In this article by these two authors I mentioned, what they say is very interesting. They say that what's happened since, and they actually relate it to the year 2011 when there was change in policy in Sweden, making it much more market oriented in the way that I've described and they describe. So they say that the school, which before that was public, has replaced public values such as democracy, solidarity, equality, and equity with individualization, competition, and learnification. Let me just explain what they mean by that. Individualization and learnification means that the student is seen to be an atom, an individual on their own, responsible for their own learning, regardless of socioeconomic conditions in which they've grown up, their family, where they live, etc., rural or urban schools. Everything is thrown onto the individual, just as it is in the market, right? So that's what individualization and learnification mean. And of course, competition is that it's a question of compete, winning or losing in school, right? So you learn that ideology from school. And what they argue in terms of Sweden is this marketization of the school system with this new emphasis, not only leads to increased differences among schools, right? So it rewards schools in wealthier areas and deprives schools of resources in poorer neighborhoods, but it also leads to increased social and economic segregation that reduces opportunities for public life. So it leads to a greater fragmentation in society as a whole and an inability to participate in public life as a citizen, because now, right, in various ways, in one's community or even in one's school, in a democratic way, because individuals are no longer seen as citizens in a community, but they're seen as isolated individuals competing in the market. That's what these two authors argue, and they do it in the Swedish context, and they do it in a very compelling way. So I'm just adding that on to what you said about your mother's experience and earlier your own experience.
And we also have a question from a prospective Swedish student. Educational student.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for a great talk. And I'm Ryan's wife, Ida.
Oh yeah, Ida.
I've also enjoyed the past few weeks, Ryan, telling me about your emails to each other. Been nice to hear about your musical experiences. I'm not so sure if it's exactly a question, but I guess I shared, like, because I'm halfway through teacher education myself, a primary school teacher. Mm-hmm. And my experience was that there's a lot of contradictions there, where it seemed like teachers in the more aesthetic subjects really was striving for these sort of more community of inquiry based and explorative learning rather than just nose down in textbooks, facts, learning, sort of tabula rasa approach. That otherwise was the case when I went out in practice and saw it in schools. So I don't know. I guess it's a struggle to see. It's so sad to see that teachers that want to get things done and want things to be different are met with a lot of big walls, just not able to make it happen. So there's a lot of good things happening in university and probably in schools as well, but it's sometimes hard to actually get it to happen at a wider scale. So theory and practice are just how can that maybe be dealt with? I know it's a big question as well, and it's how do we get theory into practice?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. And by the way, Ida, I hope you give birth soon. I know that I know that you've been waiting for a while. So yeah, I hope it comes. Baba comes soon. But I have to say, by the way, I think from my experience that actually elementary school teachers, primary school teachers, you have the greatest hope in influencing young people, because you deal with them, at least here in Canada, and I assume it's the same in Sweden, all day. Like, you teach all subjects, whereas in high school you only teach, say, math and physics, and that's what you see. It's more fragmented. You have the opportunity to really spend a lot of time with the same people. Now, it's terribly demanding. I think I've been into a number of elementary school classrooms. It's incredibly demanding, but I'll say more about that in a minute. But I think that is a real hope. One of the things I have seen, I took my early childhood educators to a number of schools, one of which we spent time, now in this, it was a grade 3 or 4 classroom mix. It was actually a blended, 2 grades in one. They were involved in growing a school garden. And my students, together with them, one week we went and we harvested all the vegetables, carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, the whole gamut. We harvested them. And then the following week, my students were involved with the same students in making chopping up the vegetables and making a large soup for the whole school, which then the whole school, I didn't do very much, but my students worked with them, and the whole school then tasted the soup, and that was the school lunch for that one day. Now, this was a wonderful experience for both the students in the school, because they were encouraged to recognize the value of nature and were involved in growing these vegetables and in then cooking. And was a wonderful experience for my own students, who actually wrote about this in subsequent written work. And we talked about it in class at some length, about the value of doing that. And I don't know if this is going on in Sweden, but actually here in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan in general, and I think across Canada, there are more and more schools, certainly at the elementary level, but even at the secondary level, which have school gardens. I see them, when I go around Saskatoon, there's schools and community gardens. So I think it's a small step, but it is a way of relating theory to practice, because the students learn the theory about, growing plants, but they also involved in the practice of it. So are the teachers. It takes committed teachers to do that, but where you have an administration, a principal, a vice principal who supports that, wonderful things can happen. Again, I'm a skeptic. I used to say to my students who were going to be teachers, I said, I taught high school for several years, and I stopped teaching it because I couldn't see myself doing that for the rest of my life. And I admire you for actually doing it. It's a job I couldn't do, right? I used to say that to them, to be honest with them. And but I do think there is some hope at different levels, not just the elementary level, but also at the secondary level, and also in universities that are waking up to the need for integrating theory and practice, if you like, theoretical learning and experiential learning, melding the two so that students have a practical, hands-on way of learning.
Hope, yeah. I hope so for Sweden as well. I hope to see more of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think maybe even you spoke about the possibility of storytelling, providing the context for that to happen, to provide a context within which both ethical and logical issues can be confronted. I think that probably points a pretty powerful way forward.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because storytelling, both children or students reading stories about the kind I mentioned from that text, but also telling their own stories about their own experience and their own problems of learning is really important. And by the way, I also think, and I've written about this, that I think that in a way, one way of seeing teaching, both at the university level and in schools, one can see it as a form of storytelling in two ways. One can talk about, say, the story of, if one's teaching physics, the story of physics. How did physics develop, right? Or the story of mathematics. How did that develop, right? Because they're fascinating things in the history of science and mathematics in general, right? But also not only teaching about storytelling about the subject matter one is teaching, but also storytelling as a teacher about one's own story, about why did you become interested in physics or history or philosophy, and what problems have you encountered along the way, and what was it difficult, for example, like what and how do you overcome those difficulties? Because when students see that you as a teacher are not all-knowing, you're a real human being, this humanizes the process of teaching and learning through storytelling. So I think storytelling in teaching can operate on those two levels. One in terms of the story of one's subject matter, and the story of how one's own story about how one came to become knowledgeable in that subject area, and also the difficulties one encountered along the way.
And that's one thing about storytelling that was always emphasized by my supervisor. He said, even in mathematics, if you don't provide people with a story, you can't contextualize the problems in the field and how to overcome them. You can only do it through a story. And so he's saying that stories are more primary in that sense than even mathematics and physics. So it's a very strong argument for the humanities.
Yes. For example, I don't know how physics is taught in schools or in universities in Sweden, but in Canada, it's like, okay, so here are Newton's 4 laws of motion, right? as though they dropped from the sky. There were four, weren't there? Not three. I should get this right. I think there were four, right? Anyway, the laws of motion are taught as though, okay, these have to be learned, and then you do some experiments with regard to them, without any contextualization on, for example, about the life of Newton, which is very interesting, about how his unhappy childhood led him to be actually a real son of a bitch, who quarreled with Leibniz about, oh, I discovered, when Leibniz came to London to talk about the calculus, which they both actually, the notation of which, the discovery of which they both came across at around the same time, Newton said, oh no, you got it all wrong, Leibniz. I was the first to discover it, right? And what's really interesting about Newton also, so not only that personal thing, but when he was young, he believed in where you turn lead into gold, right? You know what I mean?
I do.
Alchemy.
Alchemy, thank you. Thanks, it slipped my mind. He was an alchemist. He was an alchemist when he was young, right? But because alchemy was not only this ability, or this apparent ability to turn lead into gold, it was also a very radical social movement in England. And as Newton became more and more successful, he dropped alchemy completely, and he distanced himself from that political movement because it was a threat to his own career. What is even more interesting is that he actually became the head of the Royal Mint, where is stored gold, right? He became in charge of all the gold that is in the Bank of England, right? So in a way, there was a kind of a circle. He started as an alchemist. He gave up on it because it was a threat to his career, but his career was so successful that not only was he a respected scientist, the incomparable Mr. Newton, as John Locke called him, but also he was in charge of gold towards the end of his life. So those kinds of things that, those aren't taught. That's just one example. Those aren't taught in the history of science. And there are many, many other kinds of examples that, as you say, the story carries the discipline and enables students to really see, oh, these are not just abstractions that I have to learn. They actually relate to my experience. And I'll just say one of my former students, he was learning the second law of emotion, right? Which is motion. Force equals mass times acceleration. And he said, I didn't really understand it until I was playing Canadian football, which is actually a much rougher sport, much more like rugby. And he was bowled over by the force of an opposing player. And that's when he understood the second law of motion from his own experience.
Well, Howard, I know I could go on for a lot longer, but I know you have an appointment in 30 minutes from now, so we better call it time, so I don't want you to be late. But thank you very much for your presentation and very engaging discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I haven't had the chance to finish your book, although I promised that I would, so I will read the second half with vigor. But yeah, can I just extend a warm round of applause